I'm not gonna lie, I went into this game with pretty low expectations. When I first heard of Alone in the Dark over a year ago, I actually found it to be pretty interesting. I mean, it was a remake or reimagining, whatever you want to call it, of what is widely considered to be the first survival horror game, or at least the first 3D one. The original Alone in the Dark basically laid the foundation for a genre that Resident Evil would then go on to popularize. Shinji Mikami himself, director of the first Resident Evil, has gone on record saying that if it wasn't for Alone in the Dark introducing him to fixed camera angles, then Resident Evil would have been a first-person shooter. But even despite its influence on the genre, the series itself never really saw the same commercial success as its children, and after the mess of a game that was Alone in the Dark Inferno, the rights bounced from Atari to THQ Nordic, who then handed the task of developing this game to Pieces Interactive, and now we're here. Initially, this game drew my interest because of what it was, a remake of what is essentially the first survival horror game. I've been slowly falling more and more in love with this genre since I played Resident Evil 2 Remake a few years ago. Plus, the track record for survival horror remakes the last few years has been incredibly strong. Most of that is Resident Evil, but still, the genre is seeing quite a bit of success in the mainstream right now. At that time, I felt like this game had a lot of potential, even if the studio behind it was so much of an unknown that their name isn't even blue on Wikipedia. I also couldn't name a THQ Nordic published game if you put a gun to my head, but that's not super relevant. However, everything changed when Alone in the Dark got a playable demo/teaser thing that was 10 minutes long and so painfully underwhelming that any interest I had in the game evaporated. It wasn't even exactly bad as much as it was just boring and uninteresting and just kind of whatever, which in my mind didn't bode well for the full game. I was still planning to check it out when it released, but now my expectations for it were not very high. Just want to make sure that is very clear so that when I say I was pleasantly surprised by the game, you understand that I didn't go in expecting much. So when I ended up not hating it, even enjoying it to some degree, it was a nice surprise. Reception for this game has been mixed to say the least, and that's understandable. Alone in the Dark is the definition of a mixed bag, and the divisiveness surrounding it is most definitely a result of that. This game is not going to set a new standard for the genre, and at the same time, it's not the worst game ever made. As far as I'm concerned, it sits comfortably in the middle, where I wasn't blown away by it, but I didn't actively hate it either. For lack of a better term, it's pretty mid. I don't really think that's a problem, but I understand if people are disappointed by this game or even actively hate it. Okay, enough rambling, let's actually talk about the game now. The mixed bagness of this game is going to be a recurring theme in this video because nearly every aspect of it is a mixed bag. For example, let's talk about graphics. On one hand, you have great looking environments and lighting. I genuinely love the look and vibe of the mansion the game takes place in. Throughout the story, you are taken to other various locations that all also look pretty damn good. From the mysterious and dreary streets of New Orleans to the dark and dangerous bayous, the game delivers some great set pieces that all look fantastic. The game has its fair share of graphical glitches and delayed texture pop in, but I didn't really come across anything that was more than just slightly distracting. Shouldn't really be an issue at all in the first place, but it could always be worse. On the flip side of all that, you have some of the worst looking character models I have ever seen. Their faces are just bad, and it's kind of wild that that's the case since they went out of their way to get semi-famous actors to play the leads. Spent all that money for celebs to star in the game, which has worked out so well in the past, only for them to look like this in the final product. Wild. Alright, let's move on to the enemies. After all, a lot of your time in these games is spent surviving against them. Overall, I like the look of the enemies, aside from the swamp monster things that just look like a dollar store version of the molded from Resident Evil 7. They were pretty creepy looking and effective, if not a little hard to take seriously at times thanks to some bad pathing and implementation. The worst offender when it comes to implementation was this big dog monster thing that looked pretty sick, but is totally wasted in actual gameplay. All you ever do is sneak around it as it slowly sniffs its way along a predetermined path, and my god was this part a slog to get through. It's not a long section, but it feels long thanks to how goddamn slow this stupid thing moves. To make it worse, at the end of the section, you don't even get the satisfaction of killing it. Instead, you get to watch it run headfirst at you, then just die from a collapsing ceiling or some shit, and that is just so anticlimactic and whack as hell. But hey, other than that, the enemies aren't too bad, as long as you vibe with the combat, and there's a solid 50-50 chance that you do. Speaking of, I didn't hate the combat. It wasn't spectacular or anything, and it was chock full of issues, but I had more fun with it than not. It's a survival horror game, so naturally you have a few guns to shoot enemies with, and limited ammo to do so. In theory, at least. I never really struggled with ammo. I played on standard difficulty, by the way, if if you were wondering. The variety when it comes to guns was definitely lacking, as you only have 4 usable guns for the whole game, and they are the exact same between both campaigns. There is no sense of progression in the gameplay either. You don't get to upgrade your weapons or character on any level, which is super lame and not something I love. It's not like I need an upgrade tree or anything like that, but at least let me find better weapons or weapon parts to make the guns I already have better, or something, anything. Along with the shooty pew pews, you also have melee weapons you can use to whack the baddies to death with. Unlike the guns, the melee weapons have a limited use and will break after enough damage is done. Luckily, there are plenty to find around the environment, so you really shouldn't be without one for long. On top of both of those, you also have random throwables you can use in combat and stealth. Oh yeah, this game has stealth, by the way. It's pretty basic stealth, so it's not really worth talking about, but it's there. You can distract enemies by throwing objects. However, I've found those objects are better used in active combat. It's kind of fun to chuck a brick at a swamp monster to buy yourself a few seconds, or even better, you can Molotov their ass and set them on fire, doing significant damage and making you feel like a badass at the same time. In general, the combat is very hit or miss, like the rest of the game. When it's working as the devs intended, it's pretty fun, and I really enjoyed using a combination of my guns, melee, and the random ass bottles that are everywhere to take out the baddies as efficiently as possible. The problem is that the combat often doesn't work as intended, and annoying things happen, like getting stuck in a corner and only getting free when some monsters slap you loose, or having your camera disappear into the wall so you can't see anything that's happening. It was also stupidly easy to get stun locked when dealing with more than 2 enemies at once, and that was definitely very annoying. To be fair, there is a dodge mechanic that I didn't realize existed until my second playthrough, but even that only helps so much. None of this is helped by the fact that the final boss is so awful that the only thing it does well is showcase all of the issues with the combat. Spoilers for the end of the game, if you actually care. Alright, so the actual boss fight itself is super easy, barely an inconvenience, and I think the devs knew that, so to inflate the difficulty they just throw in a ton of regular enemies at you randomly during the fight. It's honestly a pretty lazy tactic, and it just ends up being super annoying. You're in a tight space with a big ass tree demon, and the game's movement is already clunky as hell, so maneuvering around the tree demon along with its demon children is just frustrating. This fight is the closest I got to actually actively hating this game. Man, I can't imagine what this fight is like on hard. God only knows, because I am not playing it again to find out. The cherry on top of all of this is how buggy the game is. I mentioned I got stuck, right? Well, that was only one of 4 different times that happened in just one playthrough. I found it to be a minor inconvenience, and sometimes I even thought it was kind of funny, but I can see a lot of other people being legitimately frustrated by this. There's a distinct lack of polish in this game, and that didn't necessarily bother me all that much, but I might be the exception. The devs haven't really worked on anything like this before, and you can see that in the final product. That being said, I think with some refinement and accounting for constructive criticism, a sequel to this game could actually turn out somewhat good. There's potential here. Alone in the Dark does actually have some great puzzles that were well implemented and executed within the game. Plus, I thought it was cool that you could choose how hard the puzzles were with different options. For example, the game lets you toggle whether or not it highlights important information when reading notes you find. You can also set it so it doesn't highlight interactable objects in the environment, just like old school survival horror games. I found these to be neat inclusions that made the game feel more new player friendly while simultaneously being appealing to more hardcore players. Alright, I guess I should mention the story. Alone in the Dark features 2 playable characters voiced and modeled after Hellboy from that terrible reboot, and that one girl in Free Guy who also played Ray's mom, apparently. I like David Harbour, and I don't know anything about JD Comer, so I don't really mind them being in this game. I also don't necessarily think the story or voice acting suffers from their inclusion. Instead, I think the story and voice acting suffer from poor direction and writing. The quality of the voice acting varies from line to line, and while I don't think any of it was outright terrible, I do think it could have been a lot better. As for the story itself, it was interesting enough to maintain my attention for the full runtime. I will say that the initial mystery and intrigue are way more engaging than the actual end payoff, but by that point I was pretty much just sitting back and enjoying the ride, as the game took me from one insane scene to the next. Much like the rest of the game, the story has its highs and its lows, and evens out to be pretty good at best. I think my biggest problem with the story was the fact that aside from one short section each, the story is basically identical between both campaigns. As a comparison, Resident Evil 2 Remake has you revisit the same locations with both characters, but their individual stories and experiences are very different, something this game distinctly lacks. In conclusion, I don't think Alone in the Dark is a particularly amazing game. I think it would be best described as good, not great. There's a lot I like about this game, and the things I didn't like never really overshadowed them, so my experience was pretty positive. And because the game is such a mixed bag, I can totally see other people having much worse experiences, and I'm not going to argue with those people because yeah, this game is very flawed. I don't think it's a breath of fresh air in the genre, and I also don't think it's one of the worst survival horror games ever made. Like a lot of games, it just ends up being right in the middle, and personally, I think that's fine. Sometimes media is just okay, and it's just not a big deal. I bought the game physically so I could trade it in when I'm done, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'll probably never think of this game again after I hit publish on this video, but I had fun while I was playing it, and that's enough for me. That being said, if you're interested in this game, you should check it out and make up your mind for yourself. You might like it or you might hate it. Either way, if you are going to get it, then you should get it on sale, or preferably for free. As much as I enjoyed the game, it is 100% not worth the full price. And on that note, thanks for watching. If you liked this video, then leave a like, and if you've already played this game, then let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And I will see you in whatever we do next.